Who would you name as the first feminist writer, or even the first professional female writer? The answer to both of these questions might be Christine de Pizan, a prolific writer at the French court in her lifetime, and a woman who wasn't afraid to challenge the misogyny of the male-dominated arts of her time. In this video, we take a look at her life and the impact her writing had. Christine de Pizan was originally named Christina de Pizan, born in Venice in September 1364. Her father, Thomas de Pizan, was a physician, a court astrologer, and councillor of the Republic of Venice. This gave him, along with 9 other men, authority over all government actions in Venice operating in secret. Although we know in later life Christine helped to take care of her mother, we unfortunately don't know her name. So Christine was born into a wealthy family with good connections, and when she was 4, the family moved to Paris as her father took up a position as court astrologer for Charles V of France. She was well educated from a young age, and this seems to have been encouraged by her father. It's even possible she studied alongside her 2 younger brothers. Her father gave her access to an extensive library, and it's likely she would have learned to read both Latin and French. She would have mostly spoken French, but as she was born in Venice, it's also possible she spoke Venetian and Florentine Italian as well. She would also have been taught in history, literature and religion, and all 3 of these subjects would shine through in her later writings. In the 14th century, the French court was also a very intellectual place, and for an intelligent young girl hungry for knowledge, it would have been the perfect place to absorb it all. We don't know much more about her life as a young girl, but when she was 15, as with most girls her age, she was married. Her new husband was Etienne du Castel, a notary who was fairly close in age to her at 25, and quickly became a royal secretary to the king. From all accounts, theirs was a really happy marriage. In 10 years they had 3 children together, 2 boys and a girl. Etienne was also unusual for the time, in that he is known to have encouraged Christine's education and creative pursuits. Her father was still a royal favourite, and so the family continued to have power and wealth. Sadly, this happiness was not to last, and in 1386, Christine's father Thomas died. With his death, the family fortunes took a dive, but there was more to come. In 1389, Etienne died. While it's not certain how he died, it's likely it was of plague when he was away from Paris with the young King Charles VI. At the age of just 25, Christine now found herself solely responsible for her 3 children, her mother, and according to some records, also a young niece. This was not a world which would be kind to women who found themselves in this position. Christine soon discovered this when she attempted to recover salaries still owing to her husband from his estates. Instead of gaining funds for her family, she found herself knotted into difficult lawsuits, which prevented her at every turn from claiming what was hers by right. However, Christine was undaunted by this turn of events, and she poured her grief into something that would turn her family's fortunes around. Using her considerable skills as a writer, Christine began to write love ballads, a very fashionable and popular art form of her time. It's also obvious from many of her poems that she loved her late husband Etienne very much, as many of her ballads spoke of the pain and loss she felt without him. By 1393, she caught the attention of wealthy patrons among the nobility. Many of them were within the court of the French king's brother, Louis of Orleans, and his wife, a fellow Italian, Valentina Visconti. Where Charles V had encouraged the love of intellect, his sons instead returned to a celebration of romantic chivalric ideals, including poetry and debates around love and romantic matters. It was this that would shape Christine's poetry. Although she felt grief in her heart which coloured her earlier writings, like many authors since, she realised she had to write what the public wanted to read, and that was the discussion of love. This led her to have many other wealthy patrons, such as the English Earl of Salisbury, but after he died, she changed her allegiance to the Duke of Burgundy, who also offered a place in his household for her eldest son, Jean. The Duke of Burgundy was so impressed with Christine's writing that he even commissioned her to write a biography of his brother Charles V, her first major work. But it wasn't long before Christine became involved in something much bigger that would make her more famous and would spark her tradition of defending women through her writing. The writer Jean de Meun published around 1275 a continuation of The Romance of the Rose, a poem that had been started in 1230 by Guillaume de Lorry. The resulting poem was both popular and hated in equal measure. It was presented as a discussion on love and what could lead to a love affair, but it mocked women and was full of misogyny. What triggered Christine to speak against it was a fervent defence of the poem written by Jean de Montreuil, a former colleague of her late husband, among others. She was disgusted with the way in which young men were being told how to behave towards women, and she was backed up by others, such as Jean Gerson, Chancellor of the University of Paris, although he was more concerned about the poem's moral aspects. Letters flew back and forth between the defenders and the attackers of the poem, and would likely have remained fairly unknown had Christine not presented copies of these letters to the Queen of France, Isabeau of Bavaria, in 1402. She also published The Tale of the Rose in the same year, a direct attack on the Romance of the Rose. Christine de Pizan was now established as a professional female writer, and her writing became more political in nature. While she continued to write love ballads for her wealthy patrons, publishing The Tale of the Rose presented her as a defender of women in literature and encouraged her to write more on the subject. In 1403, she published a poem known as Le Livre de la Mutation de Fortune, or The Book of the Mutability of Fortune. In this, the narrator of the poem, also named Christine, frames a history of how fortune has created events around a description of being transformed into a man after their husband's death. In it, much like Christine de Pizan herself, the narrator explains how they had to become a writer, at the time considered very much a male occupation. The reading of the poem, in which fortune touches the narrator on different parts of their body and makes them male, has led some to understanding this as a medieval account of gender transition. However, the narrator asserts that they use metaphors, which they state does not exclude the truth, making it difficult to be sure which way we're to interpret this. And as this is a poem, much could be considered in poetic language. It may be that Christine de Pizan is not describing a literal change into being a man, but rather one in which she has to give up her perceived femaleness and take on the male aspects of society, such as being the breadwinner for her family and taking on the role of father as well as mother for her children. It could also be that she was describing aspects of herself that she felt were male. It is notable that although Christine herself had to take on this role, she did not advocate it for women, nor did she argue that women should have political, economic, or social equality to men, but rather she defended the traditional roles of women in society and argued that there should be respect for these. At the time, as with the Romance of the Rose, women were described by the church as the gates of hell. Beating your wife was acceptable in law, and women were ridiculed and slandered in popular literature. Christine went on to argue in her writings that women looked after men from the cradle to the grave, and that men should be grateful for this care, instead of speaking badly of women. While it's not the modern feminism we would recognise today, she was nonetheless arguing that men and women had complementary roles to one another, and that the role of women as caregivers should be respected. It was not long after this that Christine wrote her most famous work. In 1405, she published Le Livre de la Cité des Dames, the Book of the City of Ladies. While this used some Latin-style syntax and prose conventions, the entire manuscript was written in vernacular French, indicating that Christine wanted it to be read by a wider audience, albeit still a noble one. While she had already responded to Jean de Meun's Romance of the Rose, this was a response designed to eradicate his arguments into the dust. She combats his statements about women through an imaginary city, inhabited only by historical and renowned women, using the book as the city. Each woman described is used as a building block for the city, and so for her arguments throughout the book, adding to the value of women in society. And while she didn't argue in favour of equality for women, she does advocate education for women, something she herself had the experience of. Part 1 of The City of Ladies opens with Christine herself reading Matthäus's Lamentations, a work from the 13th century that focused on marriage and argued that women made men miserable. Upon reading this, Christine becomes upset and feels shame as a woman, causing the three virtues to appear before her: Lady Reason, Lady Rectitude, and Lady Justice. Lady Reason is the framer for Part 1, and she helps Christine to prepare the ground for the city by casting away her past beliefs. Hods of earth she must throw over her shoulder. Instead of using reason to list everything women have accomplished, Christine has simply read what previous male writers have stated about women and believed them without questioning it. Lady Rectitude then comes to help in Part 2, in which she helps Christine to construct the buildings and houses within the city, stating how it will be filled with valiant ladies of great renown. As they build, Lady Rectitude focuses on the issue of marriage, and Christine addresses her concerns at the claims that men have of women bringing bad qualities into marriage. This is rebuffed with a reminder of all the women who showed that they loved their husbands and how they were virtuous and fulfilled their traditional roles as women, another nod to how Christine believed that women should be respected, but only within their complementary role in society. This is also the part of the book where most of the women mentioned in the whole work are discussed. The final part of the book, Part 3, is where Lady Justice comes in. She helps Christine with the finishing touches of the city, including building a wall around it and finally finding a suitable queen for it. This part focuses mainly on women who became saints, often through martyrdom. The queen chosen, of course, is the Virgin Mary, an unsurprising choice in Christian-dominated Europe. Lady Justice also warned women against listening to and allowing the slanderous lies of men who might smear their good name. The book is a study on the virtues of women and why they should hold their head high in society and be respected for their role in it. While Christine was writing mainly for wealthy patrons, Anne presented this book to Margaret of Burgundy, Dauphine of France. Her advice was for all women, from the top of society down to peasants. Around 165 women are discussed in the book, and Christine did have a source she used for many of them, Giovanni Boccaccio's On Famous Women, widely regarded as the first historical treatise purely on ancient famous women. Boccaccio was an Italian writer and poet, well regarded and respected in his day. He believed that women should be able to make up their own minds when they were adults about joining a secular or religious life, instead of young girls being placed into convents while still too young to know their own minds. While much of the rest of his writing is typically sexist and traditional in expecting women to be silent, chaste and obedient, the aspect of allowing women to make their own decision about their lives must have influenced Christine in her belief that women should have a formal education. The overarching theme of her most famous book was that of the ladies who were placed into the city. Instead of being a lady of noble birth, they are instead ladies because of their noble deeds, each one held up as an example that women should follow. This was followed up by The Treasure of the City of Ladies, a book which Christine also presented to Margaret of Burgundy as a kind of helpful book of tips on how to be a noble woman running an estate. Her advice within the book runs through many topics, and again, she presents this to women from all backgrounds, from nuns to prostitutes. But even as Christine became more famous and wealthy from her works, France was on the precipice of civil war. The Dukes of Orleans and Burgundy were at each other's throats, and this inspired Christine to send several letters to nobles in order to intervene. She sent a letter to Queen Isabeau in October 1405, begging her to mediate the argument between the two noblemen, reminding her of the traditional role of a queen as a peacemaker. In 1410, she sent a letter to the king's uncle, the Duke of Berry, asking him to intercede, but a civil uprising soon broke out, known as the Capuchin Revolt. 1410 was also a point at which, again, she changed her writing to fit what was needed, as she was commissioned by an unknown party at the court to write a manual on chivalry, a treatise on military warfare known as the Book of Feats of Arms and of Chivalry. She began by stating she had written the book in French so that all involved in a war who could not read Latin might understand it. It shows Christine was very invested in what she had to say being read by a large audience. She opened with a discussion of the just war theory, the purpose of which was to ensure that a war was morally justifiable. While she believed, along with other people of her time, that winning a war was seen as justice in the eyes of God, she also believed that trial by combat was wrong, and that only anointed rulers had the right to wage war as defenders of their people. The fact that she spoke out on these subjects as a woman shows how she had confidence in her own educated opinion and that others would listen to it. Her last major work was Livre de la Paix, the Book of Peace, which she dedicated to the Dauphin of France, Louis of Guyenne, also addressing him directly within the book in 1413. It offered guidance on how to govern well, encouraging the young prince to continue with the quest for peace, even as France continued through civil war. She is quoted in the book as stating, "Every kingdom divided in itself will be made desolate, and every city and house divided against itself will not stand," paraphrasing the same line from the Bible that Abraham Lincoln famously later used himself. Within the book, she creates an image of a utopian prince for all princes to follow, one who can listen to the advice of all those around him, would act mercifully and truthfully, and to gain respect through ruling this way. Unfortunately, before he can act on much of the advice, he died just shortly after the defeat of the French at Agincourt in 1415. The Battle of Agincourt itself led to another of Christine's writings, this time a consolation addressed to Marie of Berry, the Duchess of Auvergne, whose husband was held in English captivity at the time. It was entitled Épître de la prison de vie humaine, or Letter Concerning the Prison of Human Life. Although it was dedicated to Marie of Berry, it was intended for all women to be an audience, and it mainly dealt with finding comfort in the death of loved ones. Rather than declaring any hope that peace could be achieved on earth as she had in earlier writings, this was an older, more cynical Christine, who instead related the human body to being a prison in which the soul was trapped, and that death would set it free to go to heaven. It seems that the years of war in France and the threat of invasion by the English were taking their toll. As the violence in Paris showed no signs of stopping, it's generally believed that she went to spend the final years of her life in the convent of Poissy, where her daughter Marie was a nun. She had already lost one of her sons in infancy, and in 1425 she lost her other son, Jean, when he died suddenly. The history goes quiet at this point, until 11 years later with the arrival of Joan of Arc. The events that Joan of Arc aided, such as the coronation of Charles VII at Cream, seem to have inspired Christine to write once more. She penned her last poem, Dite de Jeanne d'Arc, the tale of Joan of Arc, a patriotic verse that follows the life of Joan of Arc, comparing her as the fulfillment of prophecies by many earlier prophets. Christine describes how she believes Joan is a gift from God, and makes much of the fact she is a female who has shown courage that many males did not, honouring Joan as a warrior, something which seems at odds with Christine's earlier ideas about women fulfilling only their traditional roles. This poem was a celebration of patriotism for France, the questioning of authority, and of a woman doing more than was expected of her in medieval society. Christine de Pizan would not live long enough after her last poem to see the trial and death of Joan of Arc, as she herself died sometime around 1430. She left a legacy of letters, poems, and books behind her that would go on to be recognised by many later authors and historians as being of great importance. While she cannot be called a feminist in the modern sense, she was a forerunner of the movement, contributing to the lot of women in her society. She encouraged education for women and advocated for their respect, and in later life, even celebrated one of them as a warrior. Christine de Pizan also challenged the male gender roles of her time, both by becoming the first paid female author in France, possibly Europe, and by becoming the sole parent and breadwinner of her family. Was Christine de Pizan the first feminist writer then? In a sense, yes, because she was certainly one of the women who laid the groundwork for later female authors in the centuries to come.